Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
So one of the things Alexander talks a lot about in his books is he's talking about having about a conception. He uses this word conception a lot, and people kind of in the Alexander world tend to seem to just gloss over this and not really sure what he means and don't really use it as much. What's he mean by you have a conception of the movements before you do the movements? The word we'd maybe use now for this would be models. So sometimes we have a model of the way things work, and then we try and use it to experiment with reality and to see how it compares to the model. And then we maybe change the model, see what happens. It's a tool for experimenting. So can you talk a bit about how you use models in this work? For example, you have a model of the postural system, and you share diagrams with pupils. You compare the pupils, each person's on the video during a lesson, you'll compare what you see them doing with the model. So what is the model? Is this a physical thing that we copy, or is it more like a mental tool that we use to experiment and to discover things?
Yeah, it's a very important question. The answer is the model is not a physical model. Physical model is more is akin to what somatic teachers that are working with their hands are using. They have received so many hands lessons that they think that they have an internal feeling of what is right, and they can judge whether a person is moving in good proportion, interdependence, according to their gut feeling of what's happening. Conscious guidance reject that idea. I am an anti-somatic teacher, and it's necessary effectively to explain how we can help students construct working models that are efficient in promoting experiments and obviously guiding and through the experiments result controlling where the pupil stands. We consider that people have to learn something, but we want to have some proof, and the students want to have proof that they have learned something, that they have changed. And so I'm going to start with an image we have already seen in our last conversation, where Alexander is talking about the internal economies. And I want to start with that. I will come back to that picture, and I will start to explain how that is in fact leading to intellectual models that are useful in practice. So that's what I'm going to share to start with. We have already seen that picture. Alexander is talking in his first book, and he says that medical experts, doctors, for example, find that most constant source of errors in diagnosis arises from the over-readiness to assume normal conditions in patients whose internal economies and muscular coordination are in fact far from the ideal standard of proportion and interdependence. So, if it's not a physical model, what is it? It's an idea, some sort of an ideal standard of proportion and interdependence. And that should allow the student to obtain an expansion of the internal space in the torso, in the pelvis, in the vocal system. That's the main goal. So I have asked the question myself, how can I conceive a model that is an ideal standard of proportion and interdependence? And the model has to be conceived between the movements of the parts, not the position of the parts. That's very important. And so, to help, it's necessary to have an idea of two concepts that are the concept of body pose and chest pose. These concepts arise from the same book, But Alexander used these ideas even in the last of his book, the last one of his books, at the end of his teaching career. And the tendency, so that's what he explains here. When we expand the chest, expand the torso, not every way of expanding the torso are, well, according to Alexander, useful or correct. So, for example, in this sentence, he says, in the first place, the tendency unduly to expand any parts or parts of the thorax in particular, to the exclusion of the other parts, is prevented by the detailed personal instruction given in connection with each exercise in its application to individual defects or peculiarities of the pupil. Moreover, the mechanical advantages in the pose, in the body pose and the chest pose assumed in these exercises, causing them to be performed with the minimum of effort and lead to an even and controlled expansion of the whole thorax. So, this is clearly the same idea as internal economy, this even and controlled expansion of the whole thorax. And so, there are different things that are coming in. We have for the moment, nothing like a definition of what Alexander means by body pose and chest pose. It's Alexander is leaving it to us to more or less conceive what he's talking about. But we understand that there are exercises. Well, for modern Alexander teachers, that's very strange to think about exercises. It could be, I'm going to present some exercises as described by Alexander. And I'm sure that many teachers of the modern Alexander take to it, or the somatic teachers, will think that these are all, well, of course, examples because they come from the first book or from articles that are coming even before the books. And they will think, well, the Alexander abandoned this way of teaching with exercises. We don't need exercises because the teacher, with his hands, is going to direct and control the movements of the pupil when he's bending, for example. So, what do you need exercise for? Well, you need exercises because you want to explore how the model can help you solve difficult problems of conception of action. We will see that in order to, for example, I'm going to show you a bending of the knee, and you will see that the new conception of bending of the knee, bending is an action. It's interesting to talk about bending the knee because it's not a static thing. It's you're clearly bending the legs and you're clearly doing something because I've got also that other comment from Alexander teachers. They say, are you asking me to do something? That is, the technique is all about inhibition, non-doing. So you're asking me to do something. Well, when a person goes from standing to sitting, the person is bending the knees, isn't it? Yeah. What we are interested in, the how of bending the knees is the conception, or the model, if you want, of the dynamic act. And so, yeah, an exercise is an experiment, a controlled experiment, geometrically controlled experiment, where you are asked, to reach for a goal. That's absolutely clear. There is no difficulty for me to explain that inhibition has nothing to do with it. Not in that sense. Inhibition is part of the model. It's part of the dynamic model. It's not a general command in life you should not do, or you should not follow an end. You should not follow a goal. No. Well, that would be, stay lying down on your table all day then, would be the only solution I see to comply with such a crazy order of inhibition. No, inhibition is technical. Inhibition is part of the model, as you will see later. So we expect to see the pupil bend the knees and at the same time generate an even and controlled expansion of the whole thorax. The internal economies is part of the game. We are going to judge whether the pupil has the proper proportion and interdependence of movements that only can make the student obtain the expansion that is the correct, internal economy. And so that is very important to understand that exercises are totally part of the way I teach the initial Alexander technique. Well, I should say the way I teach conscious guidance and control. So the next part, just to come back to the two concepts, the incorrect pose of the body and chest poise are always pointed out by Alexander as the first defects when he's observing a person performing an action. Entering the room is an action, standing and talking is an action, going from standing to sitting is an action. And so that's where we remember that observation is essential in the Alexander technique, teaching and learning. That is, it's not just how the teacher observes. No, the teacher has to also teach observation, what to observe. In conscious guidance and control, we are not interested by the internal feelings of the person when performing an action. We have no say onto what the person feels when the person is performing an action. We are not psychologists. We are not, creating an introspection into the personal experience that the person is living. That is not our concern. Our concern is technical. We want to see whether the person, when bending the knee, is going to expand the thorax, the torso as a whole, or whether the person will interfere with, so Alexander is defining the defects in standing and sitting posture, and the defect in standing and sitting posture arise because of the coordination of the movement the person has made in order to stand or to sit. That is, you can correct a sitting posture, or you can correct a standing posture, but it's time really badly spent, because in fact, as soon as the person is going to change posture, go from standing to sitting, or from sitting to standing, or after bending the knee, or before bending the knee, it's not where it's happening. The defects are happening in the dynamic conception that the person has. Yeah. So we see that the defects are defects that arise from the person actions. The person is combining action of the ankle, of the knee, of the hips, and of the torso, neck and head, while performing a gesture. And as a result, the posture that is the result and the end of that is, not what we want. The person is not expanding the thorax. And so, how do we go about, understanding these two concepts and the fact that these two concepts are linked? we don't want to work on the pose of the body to start with and then finish with the chest pose. No, it's you have to understand that in order to expand the whole thorax, it's necessary, of course, to have a correct conception of the pose of the body and chest pose together, so that during the action of changing from one posture to another, the person can, correctly direct in order to obtain this expansion. And the person needs to correctly correct the means whereby movement that are going to ensure the pose of the body and the chest pose that are not defectuous. And so, I'm going to present again the door exercise. It's a procedure that we discover in a 1910 pamphlet that Alexander was using in order to sell his lessons. It's called Supplement to Education of the Kinesthetic System concerned with the development of robust well-being. And so this is it. We have the door exercise, and it's mentioned standing. Well, yeah, you will see. It's the only moment when you can bend the knees. So Alexander has a description, and you will see that the description is full of holes that are present in text, and it's apparently for us to start to fill the gaps and make sense of what Alexander is talking about, if we want to come to understand what he's talking about. So he say, first, the pupil should stand from 6 to 12 inches from the door. And he doesn't even define how the pupil is standing. You know, when you have a person standing, and as you can see, I requested the pupil to stand with the back toward the wall. That comes from the second part of the description. It's because he says that Alexander explained that the teacher that is leading the session should then inform his student that he wishes his hips to move toward the door until the body is supported by the door and the torso extends away from it at an angle about 25 to 30 degrees. So, that it means that the pupil has to stand 12 inches away from the wall and end up with the body touching the wall and the torso at a 25 degree from the wall. So the person has to stand with the back toward the wall. Now the next problem is the 12 inches. Because when you measure 12 inches from the door, it's roughly 31 centimeter. And you set your students standing at 30 centimeter from the door. The door being the wall in that case. The door is the support that you're going to get when you are bending the knees. So the person has to bend the knees in order to reach for the wall. That's for sure. And so the question started with, where do you measure the 12 inches from? And so my students, they all show very strange shapes of the back. So it was impossible to imagine that Alexander was in fact indicating that the student had to stand with the torso 12 inches from the door. And then with practical experiment, we found that it was impossible to maintain poise while going toward the wall at 12 inches from the back. Nobody could do it in my training course. It was impossible. And so because of that obvious reason, and because it made suddenly sense, it was clear that we had to measure the distance from the heels, because the feet are not moving during the whole sequence, while every other part is going to enter into movement. So it's if you want to measure something from the start of the procedure to the end, the start of the exercise to the end, it's obvious that you have to measure from the foot as the person is turned away from the wall, we had to measure away from the heel. Makes sense. So then the next problem was the 12 inches proper, because 12 inches from the heels and reach the wall with the body is quite a feat. You will see this exercise is an exercise of equilibrium. The first problem with this exercise is how not to fall, how to keep poise during the motion, because Alexander is saying that, yes, until the body is supported by the door. Yes, but while the body is not supported by the door, you are supported by your feet, and you're moving backward. And the first thing a person realizes is that, wow, moving backward is threatening. When the feet are fixed on the floor, are placed at a position that it should not. And very often when people start, they will say, well, I'm falling. And I say, no, you're not. Well, the person says, no, I'm feeling that I'm going to fall. And I say, well, yeah, but you're not falling. Well, I'm feeling that I'm going to fall, and I can prove it that I'm going to fall because my toes are lifting. Yes, but your toes are lifting before you fall at the moment. It's as if you are taking some sort of, confirmation of the fact of that you're falling, because you're doing an action of lifting the toes off the floor when you're not falling. I never saw the problem like this. I saw that my toes were lifting because I was falling back. But yes, it's your muscles, it's your action. You've made a decision to lift the toes because you had a clue. You had a stimulus. The stimulus was, oh, I'm going to fall. So bending the knee is an equilibrium problem. And Alexander is right in saying that most people will stiffen the legs when they want to perform a movement. It's not a good idea to stiffen the joints. When you stiffen the legs, you stiffen the joints. It's not a good idea to stiffen the joints when you want to promote movement. Stiffening will tend to resist movement, and therefore, for example, if you stiffen the legs while the hips are going back, obviously you're going to lift the toes because you're stiffening the legs. So the lifting of the toes is more an indication that the person is starting to stiffen the legs, or stiffen the ankles at least. And so the person is requested to put the hips back toward the door. I really do not use that syntax at all. I'm not asking the student to put the hips back. I'm asking the student to direct the movement of the hips, while the student is directing obviously other movements, because if the hips movement is directed backward without any other direction of movement concurring, the pupil will never reach the wall. And when I say the pupil, I'm not talking about a class of individuals that are different from teachers. When I started to play with the door exercise, I had finished my training course. I was a qualified teacher of the stats system, and I was like the others. So I'm going to show you pictures. I've changed the face of the person so that nobody is recognized. But all these teachers, all these people are teachers. They are, for me, the class they are pertaining to is the class student. They are students. They are not pupils because they are already teachers. So you can't call them pupils. I call them students. So they are studying the door exercise. So you will see what it is to study the door exercise. So for example, here is a teacher. She was a teacher, and then she started having lessons with me. And we see that she's achieving, or I see that she's achieving quite a correct expansion of the torso in standing. You will see, I will explain later what is the incorrect one. So in standing, we see that from the front of the ankle right up to the ear spot, we nearly have a line. And we see that, yes, she's expanding the chest, and there are lines that are proposed for the student. It's part of the model that the student can use. And we see that that pupil is already quite clever at using that in standing. And so there are other objects. There is a chair. That is, the back of the chair is very close to her thigh. The back of the chair is there to indicate in space a vertical limit. We are interested to have a vertical limit. And she's even holding a stick, a wooden stick. And that wooden stick is set more or less vertically, touching the back of the chair and touching the sternum at the height of the armpit. That is indicated by the yellow dotted line. That is what is happening. And so she's standing more or less 12 inches from the door, from the heels. I say more or less because, in fact, I found that the 12 inches didn't work. It was too much, first. It was impossible to impose such a difficult exercise to the pupil. If you ask the pupil to perform an impossible exercise, you're not going to learn much. It's much better to propose an exercise which is within the limit of the pupil when the pupil is using the correct conception. Of course, with the incorrect conception, it's impossible to maintain poise and reach the door with the torso. Okay, but with the correct instruction, the pupil will succeed. Okay. And so I found that it was necessary for me to find some other way to measure the distance to the wall that will work with all my students and pupils. What I mean by that is that I have very tall people, very small people, I have adults, I have teenagers, I've got some very few young people. And so their morphology is all different. Some are very tall, some are very small, so 12 inches doesn't work for the tallest one. It will never work for a small person. So, in fact, in the end, I ended asking people to stand at a fist distance from the wall. I asked them to create a fist with their hand, and then I asked them to measure the distance from the side of the little finger to the side of the index finger. And that is what I call the distance of a fist. It's very simple to practice with. If you have a stick, you place the fist at the end of the stick, and then you place the second fist next to it, and then you place the third fist, and you have a 3 fist distance. So that person is standing at 3 fist distance from the heel to the wall. And then she is requested by the exercise to direct the movement of the hips backward in space so that she can be supported by the door and obtain 25 degree to 30 degree angle between the back of the torso and the wall, which means that Alexander is in fact saying that the hips are going to be directed toward the wall much faster than the shoulders. If you want to obtain a 24 degrees angle between the back of the torso and the wall, well, you need to understand that there is some inhibition involved, because you don't want, of course, the hips to go back and the lower rib cage to go back and everything to go back, because that is not the poise game. That is falling against the wall. So when you are at 12 inch, 3 fist distance from the wall, well, now you need a certain conception of what is moving at what speed, and maybe what is not moving, or what should be moving in the opposite direction. And so look at that teacher response to the system. And she's supposed to go toward the wall with the hips. And at the moment, well, if I look at her first initiation of the solution, what I find is that, she's going toward the wall with the calves. Her thighs are more or less staying in place, and the whole lower torso, lower end of the front of the rib cage is going forward relatively to the limit we have placed beforehand. As you can see, the stick that was more or less supposed to be staying vertical is immediately pushed forward. So the response or the conception of bending is rather strange. Why is she leaning forward and down so much when asked to reach for the support of the wall? And the answer is simply that it's a postural reaction. The person feels out of balance, and so our conception of bending the knees involves going forward with the lower rib cage. I don't mind people going forward with the upper rib cage. It's you will see going forward and up with the rib cage relatively to the front of the armpit line is part of the model, but going forward with the lower rib cage and protruding the abdomen is not. It's an incorrect. And why is that? Well, because she's stiffening. She's stiffening the legs and she's also stiffening the torso. So when we look at how then she solved the problem, you must understand that she's moved, the hips back in the end. She's moved the hips back with the lower rib cage going back, but the upper rib cage has gone back as well, which is something we don't want. And she's moved the knees away from the vertical. But in the end, it's an incorrect performance because she fell, and she knew she fell. The door exercise is very good with teachers that are coming to have lessons with me, because they discover that the conception of bending the knees or bending the hips or bending the torso, if you want, that they have, does not solve the problem of the door exercise, keeping poise and expanding the rib cage. And so from there, we will see all sorts of directions of movements that are necessary. For example, on this picture, she's experimenting. Now that she's got support from the wall, she's got the support, but she hasn't got the 24 or 25 degrees angle. Absolutely not, because as you can see, the middle of the thoracic, of the lumbar region is completely thrown back toward the door. I use these pictures with my student so that we can discuss together what has happened during the performance of the exercise. What were the decisions? How did the person react? And so we see that in this case, the torso is compressed downward at the front because the middle of the lumbar region, the third lumbar vertebrae that we call lumbar 3, has gone back in space. She's allowed the lumbar 3 spot to go back in space. So we can immediately ask the question, could it be possible to think of directing the hips back in space much faster than lumbar 3? And we can create a new experiment. Is it possible for a student to use an instruction formulated in that way? Is it possible? And the big surprise is yes, the student will make use of his instructions. And so it is, in order to secure the results desired, it is essential to teach the pupil to rehearse the dictated orders and not to do the exercises, to devote his attention to apprehending the instruction of his teacher. The instruction of his teacher, and Alexander described that sentence by saying, those are the means whereby he is to gain what he requires. If he wants to gain this capacity of maintaining poise and expanding the torso, he needs instructions. And not, as the student will be apt to do, to concentrate his thoughts upon the end thought. Well, there is a very simple reason for that, because if you concentrate yourself on trying to reach the door, you're going to repeatedly fall without knowing why you're falling. So you need to stop concentrating, because most of the time, or all the time, it's not sufficient to think just of inhibiting the acceleration of lumbar 3 going back relatively to the lower sacrum movement. It's necessary to combine several instructions at the same time, all together. So devoting the attention on apprehending the instructions makes absolute sense. That's how do you grasp several decisions at the same time? You will find that you need a model. And Alexander is saying the orders are necessarily prior to their execution. And if those dictated by the teachers are correct for the particular case in hand, the mental realization by the pupil will be automatically followed by their correct performance, a coordinated association with the ideomotor impulses. I'm not going into the ideomotor impulses yet, but you must understand that all rests on the mental realization by the pupil. If the pupil cannot create that mental realization, that is, if he cannot devote his attention to apprehending all the instructions all together to be performed at the same time, well, we are not discussing the Alexander technique yet. Yeah. So the next question is the mental realization by the student. And so we are going to see that mental realization of the pupil needs the two concepts of chest pose and of body pose. And the door exercise is fantastic, because the door exercise is going from standing to bending, reaching for the door. It's a dynamic act. And so we will see that the chest pose is a certain motion of the chest relatively to the arms, while the body pose is defined as a certain motion of the pelvis relatively to the legs. In that case, it's very interesting, because the motion of the pelvis relatively to the legs is happening while the upper leg is moving in space to reach for the wall. So when I start with a student, I start defining the concepts. You cannot geometrical concepts. So on this picture, what you see is a teacher is standing next to a chair. Again, we see the same disposition where you have a chair back and you have it's the broom handle that is a big stick. And the teacher is asked to use a book. A book is an object, a physical object. And at the moment, what he's doing is setting the center height of the book against the top of the stick. We are exploring a concept. Yeah. If we were capable to maintain some part of the front of the ribcage above the vertical limit in space, it would then be possible to analyze the movement of rotation of the object on the top of the stick. You see, I'm requesting the person to rotate an object above the stick. What has this to do with, the poise of the chest? Well, it is the definition of the poise of the chest, really. We imagine that if the chest was just in front of the chair, and we can define a certain height on that chair, on that chest, then having the hips go back would be associated with moving the lower ribcage backward. So the lower ribcage would go backward relatively to the limit. But you must understand then that the upper part of the chest and the neck and the head would have to go forward relatively to the limit. We are creating a new concept. We are saying, could it be possible to imagine a very interesting inhibition where we want the hips movement to be directed backward, but we don't want the movement of some part of the sternum, front of the rib cage, to move back as well, or to move forward. Would it be possible to, in fact, consent to moving the hips while not moving that spot? Well, it's an interesting theoretical idea. And when we use a book, yes, we start to see what would be the consequences prior to the execution. Prior to the execution, we can see that if there was a target on the wall and the rib cage was followed by something below, that we are going to call the rest of the torso, then it could be possible to reach for the wall with the sacrum spot, while, the front of the armpit spot on the sternum stays on the limit that is shown by the back of the chair vertical. So it's very necessary for the student to understand the concept, to understand the meaning of the word we're using. What do we mean by directing the movement of the, hip backward? Yeah, it's backward for the moment. The pupil must understand that the movement backward must be relative to a spot that is not moving back. That is a technical explanation. That is, can I move the hips back while another part is not? Can I inhibit the movement backward or forward with that spot on the front of the rib cage? If I can, okay, I understand that the top of the rib cage and the neck and the head will have to go forward. They will end up above the seat of the chair. That's what is requested. So immediately we have a mode of action. You must understand that the mode of action that we are proposing is totally different from the mode of action of the pupil. So there will be a competition between the old way of doing the exercise and what is requested. So we are going to see a reaction. We are going to analyze the reaction. So the pupil in place, and we have a measurement. We know that the heels have been measured at 3 feet distance. We know where the target is going to be, more or less. It's the blue line. And I'm also I'm asking the student to understand certain technical instructions that are relating to different lines. I have a line that is set under the armpit, and that line is conceived as 90 degrees to the sternum. There is another line, while the face is hidden, but there is another line on the face of the person that is in fact showing what I call the temple line. I'm trying to see if I've got a temple line explanation somewhere, and apparently I can't find it. So it's a line that, and I explain to the pupil how to find it by having an index finger just below the eye. There in the center of the eye socket is called the orbital, and the suborbital ridge is a bone that is just beneath the eye, easy to find. And I ask the person to touch the suborbital ridge and at the same time to insert the thumb into the ear. In that way, we have a very clear way to assess the direction of the head. So we assess the direction of the head, we assess the direction of the rib cage, and we assess the direction of the pelvis. To assess the direction of the pelvis, exactly simple. You ask the person to wear a book side on the sacrum and lumbar region. And when that is done, you ask the person to follow the connection between the book and the bone. And the person will find that the book is set along a straight line from the center of the lumbar region right to a spot on the sacrum, after which the sacrum turns away from the book. Therefore, at that point, you have no connection, no dual connection between the book and the bone. So when the person finds that spot, it's when the book is not touching, and so the person has to move the fingers slightly further up and touch again, and then we have a spot. And at the front, it's very easy to find the pubic bone. So we are drawing a line from the pubic bone to the lower sacrum spot. And now we have 3 lines. At the moment, the 3 lines are, well, they are not pertaining to the same class, same geometrical class. They are not parallel, in other words. And so that is obvious, they are not parallel. And so we are going to see how the person reacts to the instruction, I want you to direct the movement of the hips backward. Or I could say, I would like you to bend the knee so that you can have the torso supported by the wall behind you. Yeah? So, what is the student going to do? And we have to observe the exact moment of initiation. Alexander points to that in his books. He says, well, it's very interesting to look at the very moment when the person starts to enter into action. And so, understand, there is no effect. I just took pictures from the video of the lesson of the student. And what you see is that the first reaction to go toward the wall, and in this case, I think, bend the knees. The person is, in fact, not going toward the wall at all. The person is going in the opposite direction. The person is bending the ankle. You will see the torso rotate around the ankle. That's rather strange. And I can tell you, the pupil was not aware he was doing this when performing the action. It's a somatic teacher. He's been teaching the technique for years. He's a dancer. He's fantastic. But his realization of his action is totally imperfect. The first thing that happens is that when he tries to perform the action, he's taken by his habitual conception of the movement of bending the knees. He understands there is a bending of the hips, but what dominates is the bending of the knees. And so Alexander is talking about this. He is preparing the way. He says, for instance, suppose the teacher, in trying to change some malcondition in the pupil, asking to bend his knees. The pupil, thinking only of what his teacher asked him, that is the end, not how to bend the knees, but bending the knees, and desiring to do it right, as he understands doing it right in connection with the act of bending the knees. Then the student bends his knees and bends them as he has always bent them. That is, with a great amount of unnecessary tension and pressure, interfering with his equilibrium, shortening his spine by increasing the curve, stiffening his neck, and so he will attain his end, bending of the knees, but at the cost of undue strain and disadvantage in the use of an organism. His conception, his model of bending the knees is purely somatic. He's been trained to put his hands, he's been trained to bend, to go into monkey, but curiously, all the training has had no effect on how his conception of bending the knees make him react. The reaction has not changed. The reaction is the same. So when you look at the sequence now, you will see how he's going to try and reach for the wall. He's gone forward, and from that forward motion of the lower rib cage, he's now trying to go back, and therefore, relative to the limit that was set, is completely in red. And you can already predict that with the knees forward and the lower rib cage forward, it's absolutely impossible to reach the target and maintain poise. You can already say half a second has gone. It's impossible to reach the wall in these conditions. No way. And obviously, he's arching the back very much. He's arching the back, he's protruding the abdomen, he's pulling the chin back, everything is, you look at how the chest is rotating relatively to the arms. The arms are going back, the lower rib cage is going forward. This is exactly the wrong pose of the chest. And what of the pose of the pose of the body? The pose of the body is defined by how the person is rotating the pelvis relatively to the legs. Well, for the moment, what is absolutely obvious is that there is very little movement backward. But what's obvious is that the line of the pelvis, the pubic line, that I defined earlier as the pubic symphysis to the lower sacrum direction, that is lifted at the back and shortened and dropped at the front. We see that the person is arching the back. The back of the armpit line is going down. The back of the pelvic line is going up. The person is not expanding the chest in bending. The person is shortening the chest in bending and pulling the neck back, and all we need for the student to become aware of that, the consequences of his reaction. And he must be aware that his subconscious conception of bending is incorrect, because it leads to such conclusions. So when he finally reaches the wall, there is a very simple test to check poise. To check poise in the conscious guidance system, we just then ask the person, well, are you supported by the door? Are you supported by the wall? Is the body supported by the door? And we are closer to 45-degree angle to the 24 that I asked the person to perform. And so we are going to analyze how this has gone. Why is it that, in fact, the torso has not been expanded, and what can we question? What sort of movements could lead to a different end? Well, it's clear that the relationship between the rotation of the chest and the arm is unclear. The poise of the chest is not conceived properly, and the acceleration of the upper pelvis is incorrect relatively to the acceleration of the thighs. So that is also areas where we are going to start the exercise all over again. But to strike the point, the last I said there is an experiment that we can ask the person to perform is to say, are you supported by the wall? Yeah. Are you still supported by the feet? Well, the answer is obviously yes. But how much support have you got from the feet? And the answer, and you can answer that question only if you can, well, revert the action. That is, for Alexander, you control something as long as you're not falling. And how do you know you're not falling? You know you're not falling because you can go in the opposite direction without throwing yourself forward. So I then ask the person to come back to standing. And we will analyze that when the person wants to come back in standing, the person is going to throw himself forward, and I can see it. You look how the chair is moving back. Yeah, look how the lower chest is moving forward. The pupil will have a conception that, relative to the vertical of the ankle, which is represented by the back of the chair, well, the pupil is moving the lower torso forward. And moving the lower torso forward is going to arch the spine anyhow. So we have a representation, a model that is going to govern the movements. So that's the phrase means whereby that Alexander defines. Let's see how I see that, and I will end this with showing how I explain the model to the students. So the phrase of this book to indicate the reason means to the gaining of an end. The means will include the inhibition of the habitual use of the mechanism of the organism and the conscious projection of new direction necessary to the performance of the different acts involved in a new and more satisfactory use of this mechanism. So the new and more satisfactory use is first maintaining poise. If the person is falling against the wall, no poise, so we need to reconsider the conception. Because there is something to realize a conception. You can only say you realize the conception when you obtain the end with poise. And the second part, the consequence is end with an internal economy of expansion. With the poise of the chest and the pose of the torso combined to expand the whole torso. So, of course, you have to be capable of inhibiting the habitual concerted use of the mechanisms. So you have the mechanism of the ankle, the mechanism of the knees, the mechanism of the whole torso mechanism, pelvis rotation, and the rotation of the rib cage around the arms. So that's the model. We start with some sort of ideal proportion of movement. So the person has obtained some sort of realization that it was possible on the front of the ankle to more or less obtain a rotation of the chest around the arm such that the armpit line front, the spot I was talking about earlier, and the pubic symphysis and the ear spot are all on the same vertical. And in order to reach for the wall satisfactorily, that is to create the 24-degree angle, this is the idea. It's the idea that the inferior part of the knee should not move. We should not move back or move forward. If you move forward, you can't reach the wall. If you move back with the inferior part of the knee, you fall. So you can't complete the exercise. So the idea is to find how to inhibit the movement of the inferior part of the knee, either forward or backward. And the second is how to inhibit the movement of the front of the internal part of the arm and the front of the armpit line, so that, as you can see, when we see the model, it's very clear. The model has two centers of rotation. Yeah. The only thing is that one is fixed, is the lower knee, and the other one is the front of the armpit line, and the front of the armpit line is staying on the same limit in space, same vertical. I also add the different lines. And I show that in the model, the different lines are exactly in the same class. So the pupil has to direct the front and the back of the line so as to obtain the three lines parallel. If you get that, then you get the chance to expand the torso away from the sacrum. And so, to finish, where does this model come from? Look at you have the model on the left here, and it's the same model, and that is Alexander beneath it. Well, Alexander is not directing the temple line from the orbicular oris to the suborbital ridge of the eye to the ear. It's pulling down at the front. But if you look at the bel canto expression of the gorilla gesture, and the pressing down on the back of the chair. As you can see, I've been really influenced by this image on the right, and we see that the top of the chair is set exactly at the height of the armpit, and we see that the top of the book is going in front of it, the back of the book is going away from it, in such a way that we get the back to lengthen and we get the head very far forward of the back. So look at the picture on the left again, and look at the model. Same image. See? So I did not invent the model. I just reasoned out how to reach the wall when you were at 3 feet distance with your heels from it. And that is what we call a dynamic model, because I show only the start and end, or I will show it like this, the start and end. We end with a 24-degree. Alexander says 25 to 30. Practically, it's more or less impossible. Well, we settled for 24. If I someday discover a student, if you want to try it, if you want to show me, you can always book a lesson with me. And if you can do 30, wow, I will be impressed, absolutely impressed. While keeping, of course, the new bending of the knee. The new bending of the knees can be described very simply. It's just the idea that most people have that to bend the knees, they have to bend the ankle. Alexander is showing that to bend the knee, you don't need to bend the ankle. You can keep the knee exactly below the sternum. Yeah, the knee is not coming forward. The knee is blocked by the chair. It's not coming forward. For the explanation of the pictures, you must understand that these two men are doing something that we do not do very often in the Alexander technique. It's an old system where he's doing the monkey on one side and the lunge on the other. It's they are both bending one leg and having one leg back. It was a big thing in the Delsart system to show your prowess in conscious guidance. But we, for the moment, are interested by something more sober, just going into some sort of gorilla gesture or monkey posture, if you want, which means reaching the support of the door while maintaining full support of the feet. You're not to lose the poise when reaching for the wall. And so the dynamic model is going to help us see what the pupil is doing. When we observe the pupil going into monkey, that's another pupil. I observe and I say, well, here are the starting position, and he's trying to reach, well, he fell. You see, he fell. The inferior part of the knee went back. He arched the back. The head was pulled back. But he was quite good at maintaining the armpit on the vertical of the instep. And so we can improve from there. And we see that when he improved from it, suddenly the lines are becoming more of the same class, especially for the pelvic line and the armpit line. Well, the head line is still pulled down, but he's going somewhere, and we see that he can direct the inferior part of the knee forward. So that was too much of an effort, because in fact he's gone forward with the inferior part of the knee, but the thigh has gone forward as well. So he's lost height, as you can see. He's losing height and he's collapsing the pelvis a bit. But we do another try, and this time it was a bit better. And from there, he had nearly sufficient poise to go away from the wall once again. So with the door exercise, we can observe what is the conception of bending, but also what is the conception of extending, because once the person has reached the wall, well, now the new game is to go from the support of the wall to the support of the feet only. So it's going from bending to standing. And so using these models, the person will start becoming capable, able to control the different directions of movements, the means whereby that which realization is essential to become capable of obtaining the goal, which is not to reach the wall. The goal is to maintain the internal economy while moving either backward or forward. That means that the person will become just capable of standing, sitting, moving with an expanding torso. This is just an exercise. The goal is not to perform the exercise. The goal is to understand how we can model expanding the torso, so obtaining a pose of the chest correlated with the pose of the body, a pose of the pelvis onto the legs, so that the movement of the ribcage relatively to the arm and the movement of the pelvis relatively to the legs are coherent with an expansion of the torso. It was a bit long, but was worth it. I hope.
One thing that became clear during the explanation, and also this, not just your explanation, but the way of explaining, is how intertwined the model is with the experiments. So they're not like separate things. So the model is being discovered, constructed during experiments. You're understanding it by experimenting. You are the pupil is revealing his conceptual understanding of the model through the movements and actions he does on video. So you
Yeah.
don't need to try, it's not, you don't just explain something, do you understand? Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. You can see whether they understand it or not, or you can see some, sometimes there may be a physical blockage, but usually you can see that their understanding isn't clear enough or complex enough or whatever it happens to be. And I suppose that relates also to how your original work with this stuff is because you were trying to translate the Alexander's English into French, and you had to understand what he was trying to say. You had to do some experiments to try and reconstruct the model he's trying to. So he's using a model in real life, and then he tries to explain it in words, and then you're taking the words and trying to reconstruct the model in real life, the movements again. And it's obvious from watching the explanation that it's not a case of you just learn about the model conceptually and kind of memorize it and then kind of fix that model into your sitting position or standing position or whatever. It's like you said about if the person has defects, that it's in their model of the dynamic. It's the dynamic model. It's in their understanding of the movements in the actions of standing to sitting or sitting to standing, not what they're doing once they sit and what they stand, which is really important because you can change that, you can do different things, and you can see what you do on the video.
Yeah. Alexander used the verb realize. The pupil must realize the instructions. Make real. Make real is is experimenting. Is show when you go into gorilla against the wall on video. You're realizing the instructions. More or less well, but you're realizing the instruction. And then we can compare the realization with the model. And we can see when, at what time during the bending, things start to appear. Is it at the very beginning? That's the easiest way. But that's the easiest problem. When it's appearing in the way in the middle, you think, wow, how are we going to change the combination of the motions? Because it's not moving the hips. No. It's thinking of the movement of the hips relatively to the movements of other parts, or relatively to the speed of other parts would be much more accurate, because sometimes with speeds you can consider zero speed. You can say, I want the hips movement to be moving back at a certain speed relatively to the zero speed for the inferior part of the knee and zero speed for the front of the arm, or at least zero speed forward or backward. Zero speed is no movement forward, no movement backward, but there could be a movement up and down. And so you have to generate loads of connections of movements during. This is just an introduction. I have not gone into the details of the door exercise in theoretical construction. It's there is much more to discuss on this. If you want to start to understand where you're going to have to change the instruction depending on what the student is performing on video recording. It's not an exercise for everybody. In the sense that the instructions have to be specific for each student. Each student is going to introduce a different combination of movement that will lead to different sorts of defects. So, as we are here to eradicate defects, well, we need to adapt the instructions to the particular defects that is presented by the student. And the student will present a particular kind of defects when he starts with the game. But as he gets more capable of realizing the instruction, new defects will appear. It's not, that's it, you have find the defects for that student, it's finished. Now the student, you can pass to another step. No. Once the student can realize the instruction as they are given, well, new instructions are becoming necessary. And that's the point where the student will start to realize that at one stage is going to master the reasoning system of creating dynamic models, because he will have to continue exploring. The teacher will just lead the way, and we are going to eradicate the very, very big, enormous defects like the sun in the galaxy. But then you have a myriad little stars that are shining, but most of the time you don't see them. But when they appear, oh, you say, oh dear, I did not expect that. This is not exactly correct. And then you can't go to the teacher all the time. And the purpose of teaching is to transmit these ideas, how to create a model of what is going wrong and a model of what should be happening, and how to come from what is really happening right now, not when you started practicing the door exercise, but now that you're there, how do you practice, how can you improve? Every morning you stand up and you say, well, I am going to try the door exercise. And it was very strange because I have some comments by the first generation teachers about the door exercise. And Alexander's comment, according to Marjorie Barlow, is that he said that it was especially for the teachers, and when they haven't got during a long day of teaching, they haven't got anyone to put hands on them, they should practice the door exercise every single day. So the door exercise was presented in writing in 1908, and well, until Alexander's death, it was still advocated. What was strange is that after that, when Pat McDonald and the rest of the teachers that took control started the modern Alexander technique, it more or less disappeared, to the point that when I was in England in the 90s to do my training, the door exercise was absolutely not central, absolutely not practiced every day. And for the teacher who knew about the door exercise, they had a very strange version. They totally occulted the fact that the student is asked to move the hips backward toward the door and support the... No, the pupil started already on the door. So, and then the pupil had to bend the knees and move up and down along the board, which is not really interesting because the equilibrium game is absent. There was no poise involved. When you have to reach for a support that is far behind, poise is central. And so you could translate poise by dynamic of opposite movements. If you want to maintain your equilibrium, you have to compensate for the movement backward of the massive part of the lower torso by some momentum going forward. Where do you find them? How do you find them? How do you create them? And that is these questions of how to get an antagonistic action of some momentum forward and some momentum backward are central to starting to understand how to respond to new problem that are coming out of the everyday practice of the experiment. Okay?
Okay, cool. So if anyone wants to play with these models, do some experiments with Jeando, you can book a lesson with him. There's links underneath this video. So thank you, Jeando, and we will see you in the next video. Thank you.
Thank you.